Now we'll go to another topic, and that is the three spirits. By a spirit is meant a tendency to judge, will, or act in one way or another. The spirit of anything is what animates something. And animation is what drives activity. So when we talk about a spirit in the moral sense, it is something that drives your activity toward a particular goal. So we might say that someone has a spirit of contradiction, if he's always contradicting people. And in every soul there is a predominant spirit. And there are three: nature, the devil, and God. So the spirit of nature, the spirit of the devil, and the spirit of God. Three morally animating spirits. Now, you should never judge yourself or anyone else based on one or two isolated acts, because a person who has the Spirit of God can, through an occasional sin, betray a spirit of nature or even the spirit of the devil, an occasional fall. But that doesn't mean that his fundamental will, we might call it, or his spirit is that of the devil or of nature. It means a consistent way of acting, an attitude. An evil spirit in a man manifests itself eventually. St. Thomas says that it is seen when the evil person does not have time to deliberate and is called upon to do things spontaneously. His true reaction will appear. So that's how you can judge yourself too. What is your first reaction to things? What is your spontaneous first attitude? And you'll discover faults in yourself or virtues that way. Laziness, for example, or anger, impatience. Don't look at your second guess, because that's when virtue can take over. You see. But if you're looking at what is unmortified in you, look at those first reactions. Men show their character when they cannot attain what they desire. So it's not uncommon for spouses to kill each other. It's not uncommon. Whenever a wife disappears, the first person they look at is the husband. Why? Because she has in some way become something that she was not. In other words, either she's looking at another man, or she now weighs 400 pounds and he doesn't like that. There's something that he does not have anymore. You see, he cannot attain his object. So an evil person is going to just do away with her. See, many times it's because he wants to marry somebody else. There was just a case of that out in Colorado, I think it was, of a man happily married with a beautiful wife and beautiful children, a good job, everything. He was seeing another woman, and he killed his wife and children and threw them in dumpsters, or I forget, cut them up, I think, and put them in dumpsters. because of this. You see, otherwise he would have to have gone through a divorce. So you get rid of them. See, when you can't, I mean, that's extreme, obviously, but when you can't attain what you want, your true character comes out. Or when you have already attained it. So when a man achieves power, he shows himself to be what he is. That was true of Urban VI, who was the pope who I think it was Urban, the pope that came back to Rome. He was elected, and then he was just, the picture of virtue as a cardinal. And then he became a very nasty person. Everything came out. And that's one of the things that drove the schism, was his nasty personality, and drove the cardinals to take off and elect somebody else. I forget, I think it was, I can't remember which one it was. But it is true that power will manifest a person's virtues and vices a great deal. A tree is known by its fruit, and if our fundamental will is good, our fruit will be good. So the spirit is the fundamental will, in other words, how you are fundamentally oriented. So first we'll look at the spirit of nature. When we speak about nature, we are speaking about fallen nature. God created nature, and it's perfect and beautiful and good. We're talking about fallen nature, so whenever you're talking in the spiritual life about nature, almost always it's fallen nature. Nature was severely wounded by original sin. It was not completely corrupted, but it was severely wounded, and it has a tendency toward evil. The famous philosopher, I guess you could call him, Pascal, who was a Jansenist. But he did say something interesting. He said, as mysterious as original sin is, man without original sin is yet more mysterious. How do you explain his penchant for evil? So these are the signs of the spirit of nature. It detests mortification and humiliation. Detests it. It seeks itself and disregards in practice the value of supernatural faith, hope, and charity. So selfishness. It always seeks pleasure, not only in natural things, but also in the life of piety. So it's looking for the consolations of prayer, even in, it's always looking for a feel-good. It's something that makes you feel good in prayer and in the spiritual life. It doesn't tolerate well what they call the aridity and all of the trials that lead you into the higher levels of spiritual life. And so they easily become retarded souls because they stop. It always seeks what is exterior and has a very difficult time practicing the spiritual life. So it's very conscious of how it is seen, what others think. So there's a tendency to hypocrisy in it, to do things that would have other people think that you are virtuous. It is incapable of any zeal in love of God. The only zeal it knows is the pursuit of its own egoist aims. Don't think that clergy cannot be infected by this. There are many clergy, in the past who were extremely ambitious with the idea of getting honors, become a monsignor, become the bishop of the diocese, and would do all sorts of obsequious things in order to rise to that. It was not uncommon. Because the spirit of nature cannot find pleasure in the spiritual life, it considers piety to be an excessive austerity or an exaggeration. So it is not inclined to piety. It declares that one must follow the middle course between perfection and evil. So don't overdo it. And this will cultivate a spirit of lukewarmness. Lukewarmness is to do the absolute minimum in order to stay out of mortal sin. So to go right to the limits of mortal sin and do the minimum in the spiritual life, and to have all sorts of habits of venial sin without any idea of mortifying them. That's lukewarmness. The idea of perfection in the spiritual life is an exaggeration, and it's just not for me. It might be for the saints in the desert or something like that, but it's not for me. He judges everything from the individual point of view and not God's point of view. So how it will benefit him, and not how it benefits the glory of God. All of his judgments and actions flow from the pursuit of purely natural ends at the expense of supernatural ends. So, typically these people are, I think Novus Ordo is full of them. Priests who will neglect their spiritual lives but be very popular with the people. People priests, and shaking hands and smiling, and see, that is so typical of the spirit of nature. What they do in the Novus Ordo, just like the Protestant ministers, after Mass they go down to the back of the church and they're shaking hands with, how are you? And instead of, first of all, encouraging the people to stay after Mass themselves, and himself giving the good example of making a thanksgiving after Mass, it's press the flesh, as they call it, the shaking hands and interacting with people. It's typical of the spirit of nature. And this is what the supernatural calls for everybody to be, particularly if they have received communion, to be on their knees praying after Mass. That's the supreme moment of the spiritual life, because heaven is the beatific vision, union with God. The closest thing that you come to heaven in this life is Holy Communion. So it's the supreme moment of the spiritual life. It is the most important time to pray. It is not the time to go chat with people about really nothing. How's your dog? It's things like that. Talking about the spirit of nature, and this is the spirit of fallen nature. So all of his judgments and actions flow from the pursuit of purely natural ends at the expense of supernatural ends. So all of the capital sins are very active. Through avarice, there's a love of money or of worldly goods, what money can buy. And through gluttony, there is a love of excessive eating and drinking, God bless you, as well as of partying and dissipation. That's part of gluttony. It's also part of gluttony to be too picky about what you eat. Those where everything has to be very, very daintily prepared. They said of Winston Churchill, it's easy to please Winston. All you have to do is give him the best of everything. So you may not be overeating, but you might be so excessively attached to the taste of food that you can only eat gourmet things. See, that's gluttony too. So and partying and dissipation goes along with gluttony. That's, alcoholic drinks too. It's part of gluttony. Sloth is a neglect of duties of state, particularly in the spiritual life, when it concerns the spirit of nature, in favor of something he likes to do. See, we shouldn't think of a slothful person as someone who sits around on a chair the whole day and eats candies and gets fat. They could be very active people, but they are not doing what they should be doing. They're doing what they like to be doing. They are neglecting their duties of state in life in favor of something that pleases them for the moment. Then there is lust, which is a tendency toward impurity. In these kind of people, if it does not lead to mortal sin, it leads him to compromise Catholic standards of purity, dismissing them as puritanical or scrupulous. See, so it may not get as far as mortal sin, but there's a spirit of lust in the sense that the normal precautions taken against sins of lust are what we, as we say in English, over the top. In other words, too much and puritanical. Lust leads to hardness of heart. Lustful people, even though they fall in love with everybody, they are full of hardness of heart and selfishness. Because lust is the lowest form of love. Lust is to love someone or something for yourself. So it's an act of selfishness. And that's why from jealousy, people shoot their boyfriends or girlfriends, as the case may be, because if I can't have you, then no one will have you. You see that? See, I have you. You see, it's like possessing something. It's very common. Very, very common. And that comes from lust. It's when you have relationships based on lust. Pride, which is a tendency to see the value of everything as it pertains to his own natural goods. See, so in the spirit of nature, that's how pride comes out. And it leads to boasting and ambition for worldly honors. You can find that in priests, constantly talking about things that they've done and the decorations in the church that they did and the money that they raised and this and that and this and that. In a boastful way. And in regard to envy, there is a tendency to see life not as a disposition of divine providence, but as a struggle for the survival of the fittest. Thus, those who are ahead are the objects of hatred for what they have. And those who are behind are the object of contempt for what they don't have. That's the way envy looks at everything. And in the case of anger, it's an inability to bear the cross. Anger pushes off evils. That's the idea of anger, is to not accept them and not be sad over them, but to push them off. So you push off the cross. That's every time you get angry, if it's a sinful anger, you're pushing off a cross. So he becomes impatient even with minor things. Not even the slightest discomfort or problem can be tolerated. And he's overbearing with inferiors and contentious with superiors. All right, so that's the spirit of nature. Then there is the spirit of the devil. The characteristic of the devil is to lift us up by pride and then cast us down into discouragement and despair. Once he has you in despair, he completely owns you. Once you say, "Oh, I'm too awful to go to heaven. God will never forgive my sins. I'm finished." You are capable of any sin whatsoever. So that is a big goal of the devil. And he achieves that in a prideful person by puffing them up, bringing them to great heights, and then throwing them off the cliff. So the devil will not, therefore, discourage exterior practices of mortification. Often those who have the spirit of the devil are those who are outwardly very fervent souls, models of external observances of the spiritual life. That doesn't mean that everyone that's a model of external observances has the spirit of the devil, but it is something to look for. In other words, if somebody is sanctimonious, that's the word in English, very, very, very conscious of tiny details of the spiritual life and which necessarily attracts attention, and where they look down on others who are not at their level. That is typical too. There's something unnatural about it. It's too studied. However, the devil will not inspire to interior mortification through humility of heart, obedience, or distrust of your own judgment. Those things are very much alive. So you will get in communities people who will, do very austere penances, always in the view of others. At the table, and very austere. That's why you have to get permission to do special penances. We don't want people doing this sort of thing. But what attracts attention, that's the thing. When piety attracts attention, you have to suspect this. Somebody that might go up to the statue of the Virgin Mary and collapse in front of it and weep and light 10 candles and spirit of the devil. Probably. If there's any kind of ostentation in the spiritual life, immediately you have to suspect that. And most likely inside they are as proud as peacocks. They will become scrupulous about a trifle, but lax and liberal about the more important things. See, scrupulous people tend to be scrupulous about certain things, but not about everything. And a common cause of scrupulosity is pride, because you trust your judgment too much. It could be from temperament too. You shouldn't think, well, I'm scrupulous, therefore I'm prideful. Not necessarily, but usually a priest can figure that out for you. But very often it's pride. And you have to know that, for confession too, you have to be able to read people in the confessional. Very often it's pride, but also sometimes it happens when people convert from a sinful life. And they're so afraid of sinning that they think, did I commit a mortal sin? Did I commit a mortal sin, etc. Yeah, that's lasts for a certain amount of time and then goes away. But it does happen if somebody has converted from a sinful life. It also happens by people who are naturally timid. They can't. They're always in doubt about everything. That is not the spirit of the devil, but it could come from the spirit of the devil. And watching the other things that they're not scrupulous about is a way to see that. The devil leads us to have a good opinion, even a great opinion of ourselves, and leads us to prefer ourselves over others, to boast of ourselves, and in an unconscious way to pray like the Pharisee. I thank God that I am so wonderful. Not like these others. That's the prayer of the Pharisee. He will have a display of a false humility. And one of the ways in which this happens is to speak ill of yourself in certain matters in order to prevent others from speaking ill about you on another point. So you downgrade yourself in front of people for an ulterior motive. He will inspire us with a love and curiosity for what is extraordinary and marvelous. Thus, those who have a penchant for apparitions, manifestations of the devil, the end of the world, the apocalypse, etc., may be under the influence of the devil. May. If they have an obsession about those things, it's one thing to talk about them or to be, legitimately concerned about them. But people who have obsessions with apparitions and obsessions with possession, that, I have a cold, I must be possessed by the devil. You'll get that. You'll get these people that want to get exorcised because they don't feel good or they're insane. Usually they're insane. They think that they've tried everything else and they think that if they get rid of the devil in them, they'll be okay. There is clinical insanity, and it isn't taken away by exorcisms. The way there's various means of determining a true possession, and that's not our domain here to talk about it today, but you don't take somebody's word for it that they're possessed. And that's very typical, the spirit of the devil. It's something, it's extraordinary, or end of the world, somebody obsessed. You see a lot of this among traditionalists, I'm sorry to say. The apocalypse, everything is, apocalyptic, and they may well be under the influence of the devil. It's one of the signs. The obsession with the extraordinary. He will inspire in us a false imitation of real virtues. For charity, for example, he will substitute liberalism or humanitarianism. Bergoglio. He will inspire a bitter zeal, which is to seek virtue not for the sake of the love of God, but for the sake of making others be like us. So bitter zeal is always manifested that way. You want to make everyone like yourself. It's motivated by pride. It's known as bitter zeal. And it is bitter inasmuch as it is accompanied by severe reprimand and sometimes fanatical observance. You can get some spiritual directors that way. Nobody here. But sometimes priests will do that. They will assume an excessive role in your life, and they want you to be like themselves. It happens. And you get these severe reprimands if you don't come up to being like them, and it happens. They see everyone else's faults but are unable to perceive their own faults. This spirit of the devil always fosters dissensions and hatreds. Whenever you see dissension and hatred in a community, you've got the spirit of the devil in it. These people do not communicate peace to those around them. Beati pacifici, that means, it's translated, blessed are the peacemakers, but it means to radiate the peace of your own soul to others. It's one of the signs of being in the state of sanctifying grace is that radiation of peace. People infected with this spirit often put themselves on pedestals. So that's the spirit of the devil. It's not uncommon, but on the other hand, not everyone has it, but you do see it once in a while. Then there is the Spirit of God, which is very simple. it is that tendency to judge and act according as the Holy Ghost inspires us. So all the supernatural virtues, the gifts of the Holy Ghost, so that we get that spirit from those things. And thus it is characterized by a practice of interior virtues which are externalized, but not in an indiscreet manner. In other words, you're not trying to draw attention to yourself by the practice of virtue. The soul's mind and activity are dominated by the three theological virtues, as well as by humility and mortification. So the Spirit of God is the easiest one. So those are the three spirits.